What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? What would have happened if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? He would certainly have taken Brussels, and he might have tried to advance toward the boundary of the Rhine and Schelt. But there was no possibility of long-term success. He would surely have gone on to lose within weeks or months because although the British, Dutch, Belgians, and Prussians were involved at Waterloo, neither the Austrians nor the Russians were, and they had armies of 150,000 to 200,000 waiting in the wings. In particular, the Tsar wanted Napoleon destroyed. He didn't believe Europe could remain at peace if Napoleon remained at large. I wouldn't have thought that Napoleon would have enjoyed success for more than a few weeks. If he had won the battle, Wellington would have withdrawn what was left of his army, and Napoleon would have had to hurry back to Paris. The Allies would have waited until the Austrians and Russians had invaded and the British and Prussians had recovered, then would have teamed up together. Napoleon wouldn't have had much chance at all. Why did Napoleon lose at Waterloo? Napoleon had a big problem because he was surrounded by various countries that were desperate to get rid of him. There were four main threats once he established himself back in Paris: the Anglo-Dutch army under Wellington in Belgium, the Prussians under Blücher in Germany, the Russians under Barclay de Tolly, and the Austrians under Schwarzenberg. That's nearly 500,000 men under arms, and they all planned to converge on Paris. The only way he could possibly win was to make the maximum use of the time it was going to take Russians and the Austrians and so on to get there. While they were marching, he had to deal with the others, in particular Wellington and Blücher. He wanted to defeat the Prussians at Ligny, while Wellington was held off by a smaller force. Once the Prussians were defeated, he could turn the combined strength on Wellington. He succeeded partially at Ligny. His strategy worked, and he split the two allies, turned on the Prussians and defeated them, but he didn't crush them. He let them withdraw and recover. That was a mistake. Napoleon allowed them to withdraw north instead of east, and by withdrawing north they were able to turn and then rejoin Wellington's forces. Napoleon had no possibility of finding large numbers of additional soldiers, because he was now reliant on the French population alone, and while he was on Elba, France had abolished conscription. As long as the Allies could unite their forces against him, he was hopelessly outnumbered, and his failure to drive home his advantage after Ligny proved to be a fatal mistake. So, if Napoleon had stopped the Prussians at Ligny, he would have defeated the British at Waterloo. Wellington knew the Prussians were coming. He had been promised that they were coming, which is the actual reason why he stood at Waterloo and defended that bridge. If he knew the Prussians were not coming, then he would probably have withdrawn until he could join the Prussians, and therefore the battle would not have taken place, not there anyway. So the crucial thing is the Prussians and their arrival clinched at the battle. Did the people of France support Napoleon's return from Elba? The most important thing to remember is that the French people were war-weary in 1815. They wanted peace above all else, and few believed Napoleon could deliver that. On the other hand, there was no enthusiasm for the Bourbons and certainly no desire to go back to the ancient regime. The fear was that the Bourbons would try to restore the kind of aristocratic and clerical authority that had existed previously. Napoleon had surrounded himself with luxury and riches at the height of the empire, but when he returned from Elba in 1815, he sought to present himself as the little corporal of the army who had risen through talent to be its commander, but who remained essentially a man of the people, true to the ideals of the Revolution of 1789. This proved a clever tactic. Most of the old soldiers were tremendously loyal to Napoleon. Napoleon had raised the standing of the ordinary French soldier during all those campaigns. He was extremely generous and gave them good pay. When he came back from Elba, thousands of these men, who had been thrown out of the army by the Bourbons coming back, had nothing and were no longer the number one citizens like they used to be. So they rejoined Napoleon in their thousands. If he abandoned his imperial ambitions, could Napoleon have negotiated to stay in power in France rather than the Allies restoring the Bourbons again. He died too at the beginning after escaping Horn-Elba. He tried to convince the European powers he wanted to avoid war and that he renounced all claims to Belgium, Holland, Germany, and Poland. He was unsuccessful, of course. This was never realistic. Russia wouldn't allow it, and I'm not sure that Britain would, either. Britain did, however, want France to remain a viable European power, since it was an important part of the balance of power structure on which peace depended. Britain was aware of the possibility of a rampant nationalistic Prussia, and was very aware of the threat posed by Russia, especially in the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. Britain particularly needed to maintain lines of communication with India. Remember that Britain was an emerging global power in 1815 and that the Russians were aware of that. So they needed to protect France's position, but that also meant that they had to be sure France would be a responsible member of the international community. For that reason, they had to get rid of Napoleon. It didn't really matter who else was there. The Bourbons would do. But they were sure that they did not want Napoleon to play that role. If they wouldn't accept him as a ruler of France, would the Allies have still exiled him to St. Helena and risk him escaping again? Forrest, Napoleon himself, was much more terrified after Waterloo of falling into the hands of the Bourbons, who might have done just that. He chose to surrender to the English in the hope that he would be allowed to live as a prisoner under House Anist in England. In other words, the British would treat him decently with a modicum of respect. As we know, the British rejected that option and exiled him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, far removed from Europe, from which there was little possibility he could escape. In France, he could have faced a trial for treason and possible execution, as happened with Michel Ney and others of Napoleon's loyal lieutenants. But that course was not without its dangers. The regime would have risked turning Napoleon into a political martyr and, given the dévenon in which he was held by his followers, it surely would have got one. I think you could make the point that the Allies had to deal with Napoleon a little delicately in 1815, because there was a real danger that they would create a martyr, in the process dividing French opinion and risking lasting instability. If France did destabilize and wasn't able to balance power in continental Europe, how would this have changed history? Forrest, the United Kingdom would definitely have become the most dominant world power of the 19th century, which is what did happen anyway. The next challenge, except for the colonial wars taking place in China and so on, is going to be the Crimean War, which essentially means that the balance of power that was established with events in 1815 more or less holds.